It's good to see everybody here today. You braved the fall weather to get here, which I'm so excited for. I love long shirts and football, so it's like, man, it's just a match made in heaven. Anyways, I want to talk to you guys about stories, because I find more and more as I go in life, I love a good story. Not like Hallmark Channel stories, but like good stories, you know? Like something about stories that sort of tugs at our heartstrings. It moves us emotionally. It brings us to a place, if it's a good story, where we start to think about our life, you know, and like, man, what am I doing with my life, right? A good story will kind of bring us to that place. And growing up, there was these books that would hold this collection of stories that were just designed to help you sort of evaluate your life. And you may have heard of these. They're called Chicken Soup for the Soul. There's a bunch of them out there. In fact, I did a search on Amazon, and there's like over 2,000 search results. When it gets up there, you'll see it. It's pretty exciting stuff. But here's the tagline for the Chicken Soup for the Soul books. It's changing your world one story at a time. That just sounds powerful. Like, I don't care what you want to do for a business, but you should just choose that as your tagline, changing your world one story at a time. And there's like over 2,000 results when you look for Chicken Soup for the Soul books. They've got them for every situation in life you could ever find yourself in. There's a book with stories that will help you through. Okay, I just want you to know that off the bat. So if you're like looking for something, you know, something to go by the toilet so you got something to read, these work really great in those situations, just a heads up. I was sort of perusing through the different Chicken Soup for the Soul books that are out there, and I came across some that I found to be some of my favorites. First are the usual ones that you'd expect, you know, Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul. For all of you students, you're getting ready to go back to school, there's some stories in there to kind of help pump you up and get you ready to go, to face life, you know, what's going to happen. There's even preteen, Chicken Soup for the Preteen Soul. So if you're like maybe 5th grade, 6th grade, maybe going into middle school and you're not really sure, because like no one's sure about life at that age, there's a book for you, some stories to help encourage you. It's out there. Chicken Soup for the Mother's Soul, there's probably like 1,000 of those. That's probably half of those, because moms just love stories. You just love stories about other moms, about kids. There's something inspirational about it. But then there are some other ones that sort of piqued my interest as far as like, I don't know where they were going with this, but it's out there. It's Chicken Soup for the NASCAR fan soul. It's people that watch NASCAR, you know, they need stories in their life too. I mean, you're just sitting there watching the cars go in a circle. I mean, you need something to do, right? So they've got books for you with stories. It's great. There's also a Chicken Soup for the Canadian soul. You know, for those that are Canadian, I mean, they kind of get the little brother status, you know, compared to us. They're really nice people, but I guess they need stories too, help encourage them in what they're doing. There's also Chicken Soup for the cat lover soul. And there's more than one of these. I don't know, why are there so many stories about cats? Like, who cares? Like, if you love cats, that's awesome. You should get that book. My version of hell will be reading that book. That just sounds terrifying. But, you know, there's some cheesy ones, but here's what I know to be true, right? There's all these stories about different things. As a good story can move us emotionally, right? Maybe even one about cats. I don't know. Maybe it can move us. But stories they cause us to analyze our own lives and they sort of move us to action. And in this series that we've been doing, Jesus is Greater Than, we're walking through the book of Hebrews, and today we're going to walk through a collection of stories. And Pastor Jason has described Hebrews as Cliff's Notes of the Old Testament. Well, today what we're going to look at is sort of a flyover of some of the stories in the Old Testament from creation to Jesus. It's a big chunk of time that we're going to kind of look through. And what we're going to discover as we look at these stories, and our big idea is that stories in the Bible encourage our faith today. The stories that are in the Bible are not just there to record history, but they're there to encourage your faith and to encourage my faith today. So we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 11 if you want to get out your Bibles. If you didn't bring a Bible or don't have one of your own, you can feel free to use our share Bible. And if you don't have one, you're welcome to take that one home as our gift to you today. We love giving away Bibles. But that's on page 843 in the chair Bibles. You can also use your phone with the Creekside Church app. There's notes in the program. The words will be on the screen. Lots of different ways to engage with this. So let's start reading in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Here's what it says. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. So in this kind of opening of this passage, most people, if you said, well, what is faith? Like if you were to ever ask that question, or if you were ever to Google that question, you probably would get pointed to this chapter, because there may be a heading in your Bible that says, you know, the faith chapter, or stories of faith, or heroes of faith. Kind of this whole chapter is sort of themed around faith. But what's interesting here is although sometimes we kind of look to this as a definition, I don't think the writer of Hebrews is trying to give us a thorough definition of faith. What's going on here is we're kind of getting a framework or a perspective of how we view stories of faith. How are we supposed to sort of interpret and understand the stories of faith in the Bible? And this writer is giving us sort of two lenses or two perspectives that we can view stories of the Bible through. So we're going to look at two aspects of faith that are brought into focus here. So the first one is that faith is confidence in what we hope for. Confidence in what we hope for. And, this is great. It's good to kind of help us understand and wrap our arms around faith. But sometimes we have to redeem certain words from our cultural understanding. Because we kind of have one understanding of a word, but it may not be what the Bible meant by that word. And one word in particular is the word hope. Because when I think of, like, what are things that we hope for, I think of things like winning the lottery, right? Or that your favorite sports team, pick your flavor, whatever it is, that they're going to win, the playoffs or win the championship. Like, those are things that we hope for. If you're single, you hope that you're going to find your soulmate. If you're a student looking at the school year, you're hoping for a ton of snow days this year, right? And if you're a parent of a student, you're hoping for no snow days this year. You don't want them in your home more than they have to be. But these are the type of things that we hope for. And really what hope is it's kind of like wishing upon a star, right? How are we supposed to have confidence in hope? When that's what we understand hope to be, it sounds pretty foolish to have hope, right? To have confidence in things hoped for. We have to understand that the biblical understanding of hope is something different. Biblical hope isn't based on wishful thinking. It's based on God's promises. And His promises are reliable and eternal. And this hope is essentially, I love this, it's anticipation. It's anticipation. And maybe when you were a kid, I just had my 35th birthday, and I know I look a lot older than that. Trust me, it's 35. Life's done a lot, okay? But as a kid, if you ever remember growing up, and you were like really excited, and you would like anticipate your birthday, right? You were looking for it because you knew there were going to be presents and treats and all sorts of fun stuff. There's going to be a party, and like you were excited. You were anticipating that day. But there was also sort of this sense of like mystery. Like, maybe there's a surprise. I don't know what's going to be in those presents. And so there was like this mix of anticipation and anxiety or the sense of like, well, what's this going to be? What's this going to look like? And that's kind of what faith is. That's just kind of what we mean by faith. Birthdays combine assurance and anticipation, and so does faith. Faith is the confidence based on past experience, which includes the stories of faith, things that we're going to look at today, that God's promises will surely be ours. That what God said is going to happen. His promises are eternal. They're reliable. They're true. Those are things that we can hang on. We can have assurance. We can anticipate because we know God is going to come through. So faith is confidence in what we hope for. But also it says faith is assurance of what we do not see. And again, the word assurance sometimes can be lost in our cultural understanding. Because right now, in this sort of the season we're in, if you watch a lot of TV, there's a lot of like political commercials right now. And this person is saying, that other person stinks, you should vote for me. Here's all the stuff I'm going to do. And there's a lot of assurances in these commercials, but there's really not a lot of follow-through, right? And half of it doesn't ever happen. And so when I think of assurance, those are the types of things that I think of. A better word here, instead of assurance, is the word conviction. That faith is a conviction. It's a firm belief in something. It's a firm belief in something. And what the writer says, it's assurance of what we do not see. He's speaking of God's presence and God's power. So it's a firm conviction in God's presence and His power. That is, even though I don't see it, it's real. It's sturdy. And sort of like to sort of compare this to something that we would come in interaction with, I think of gravity. Right? None of us are denying that gravity is a real thing. I hope not, because it's not going to end well for you. Okay? So gravity is something we believe in. Like we have a firm belief in gravity. I'm not going to jump off a building because I know that's not going to end well. We have a firm belief, but we don't necessarily see it, right? We don't have any evidence, but we know its power, we know its presence exists by what we see around it. And that's kind of what we're saying here is faith is like sort of this conviction of the unseen, of God's presence and His power in our lives. So the framework that the writer of Hebrews is providing reveals that faith kind of has this dual perspective. And the way I like to sum it up is this, is sort of the one lens is looking forward, right? Looking forward to this sort of anticipation of God's promises, of the things that God has said is true in His Word for us. But then it's also looking up, to be reminded, to have that conviction of God's presence and His power in our lives. So sort of these two lenses are how we're called and how we're told to view stories of faith. It's going to kind of help us understand what's going on here. And while we're on the subject of redeeming words, I think it's also important that we talk about the word faith for a second, because I think sometimes we think of faith as sort of this noun. Faith is sort of the stuff of belief. But what we're going to see in the Bible is that faith is a way of living, not just a belief. When we talk about faith, we're not talking about the noun. I have faith in this, or I've got faith in that, or whatever we have this thing that we possess. But it's talking about a verb. It's a way of living. And I think a better way to say it, instead of by faith, when we hear that phrase, what maybe we should think in our heads is faithfulness. Faithfulness. When we hear by faith, think faithfulness or faithful living. It's sort of a better way for us to understand it, because faithful living or faithfulness points to an attitude for how we approach all that life will throw at us. And it says in verse 2 that by faithfulness, or through faithful living, the ancients of old were commended. And as I was sort of thinking through that and pondering over that, I thought, well, is it any different for us today? Because, he's sort of pointing back and looking at these guys and saying, these guys were commended for this. Well, let's look forward and look to us and say, well, what about us? Is it the same? Is it something different? So let's keep reading, because he's going to kind of help us. The writer's going to help us understand some of this. So let's keep reading in verse 3 here. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So the writer here sort of starts this list of stories, this collection of stories, by looking at the origin story. Where do we come from? How do we get here? And that's something, we put a lot of value in origin stories. That's why it's so popular in our culture. There's so many movies right now that include origin stories. And basically what we mean by origin story, when we say that phrase, what we're saying is sort of something, it sort of helps you, that gives you the backstory of how a character came to be, or how someone came to be who they are. So it's looking back to say, well, how did this all get here? And so the writer begins sort of this, looking at the creation story, like the how do we came to be story, to start off this list of stories. And I know that's a source of major debate today, is, well, how did this all get here? And I don't have enough letters and titles after my name to help us understand all of that today. And we don't have time really to get into it. But what I do know, and what the writer wants us to know, is that the source of everything that we see was God. It was formed at God's command. And everything we see is a result of God speaking it into existence. That's what we have to go off of, because I wasn't there. You probably weren't there. I'm just going to make a guess, right? None of us were there. We weren't there to see it. And so what we can take comfort in, what we can hold on to, the most important thing is to know where it all started, and it started with God. And then from there, we're introduced to two men. We're introduced to Abel and Enoch. And we see that by faith, it says that Abel offered a better sacrifice than his brother Cain, and that his faith still speaks to us today. So what's going on here? Okay, so we have two brothers, Abel and Cain, and both of them brought an offering to God, of sort of their best stuff. They brought it to God, and God received Abel's offering, but he rejected Cain's offering. And that frustrated him to the point where he murdered his brother. It's a pretty crazy story. It's like the first murder in history. It's pretty intense stuff. And what the writer is sort of wanting us to see is the reason why God accepted Abel's sacrifice was because he was faithful. It says that what set him apart was his faith in God, or his faithful living before God, that he was a man of faith, and that's why he was received by God. And then we read a story about a guy named Enoch. And Enoch is just this tiny little, you almost miss it if you blink, story in the Bible, but about a guy who walked faithfully before God. And it says that he walked faithfully before God to the point where it says in Genesis 5, and I love this, it says this, that he was no more because God took him away. How cool is that, right? Life goals. Just want to live in such a way that God's like, all right, let's just, let's skip all the formalities. Just come and hang out with me. Let's just do this. So he lived faithfully, and both these men were commended for their faith. The way that they faithfully follow God is what the writer is pointing to. So what are we commended for today? Well, verse 6 makes it clear that for us to come to God, we must be people of faith. We must faithfully choose to follow after him. It's impossible to follow Jesus without placing our faith in him. And furthermore, it says here that if we want to come to God, we must believe that he exists, right? We have to believe that he exists, which is looking up, right? As we talked about our two lenses, it's the looking up and being reminded in the conviction of the reality of God's presence and his power, and that God rewards those who earnestly seek him, right? This looking forward, like this anticipation of God's promises, of what he said about us. That's what we're called to do. That's what it looks like. We're called to take God seriously because he rewards those who earnestly seek him. It's not just a passing interest, but it's a passionate following after Jesus. And I just, before we go further, I just want to stop and address one of the next steps on our Discover card. The first one there that says, become a follower of Jesus. And I don't know today what your faith level or what your faith looks like or doesn't look like. Maybe your faith is simply just kind of a noun, right? You've got the content, the stuff of faith, but it doesn't live itself out. There's no verb. There's no action to faith. You understand who God is, but that's kind of where it ends. And maybe you've kind of had this passing interest where you're just sort of checking things out. You're kicking the tires, but God is calling you to passionately follow him. He's calling you to step out and to put your faith and your trust in him. And if you find that as you look forward, you're looking for hope in the future. You're anticipating, you're longing for something better than what this world has offered you. And you want certainty, you want conviction, and something bigger than you in the here and now. Then I tell you that the next step for you is to put your faith and your trust in Jesus. Say, Jesus, I'm all in. Jesus, I want to hop onto this journey of faithfulness. Not just faith, but faithfulness. And if that's you, would you mark on your Discover card, become a follower of Jesus? And we would love to pray for you even here today after service. But I'd love to email you this week and just talk through next steps about what it means to faithfully follow Jesus. And if you're checking that, man, I'm so excited that you're here today. And if you're kicking the tires, I'm so excited that you're here today as well. So let's keep jumping in here because we've got a lot of scripture to cover. The next section that we're going to read is 37 verses. I'm just going to tell you, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a lot. Just telling you, it's a lot, so buckle up. Some of these are stories you may have heard. Some of them may be stories you haven't heard. But either way, you're going to hear them right now in just a short form. But here, I've got a job for you because I understand here in 37 verses was not your idea of coming to church this morning. So I've got a job to keep you interested in this part of the message. Every time that you hear the phrase, by faith, that particular phrase, I want you to count. And I'm going to quiz you. So I'm going to ask you afterwards, and I better get an answer, all right? Last service, it was about 50-50. People got it, people didn't. They were one off. So let's see if you guys are sharper than the 9:30 as far as knowing how many times by faith is going to show up, okay? Are you with me? This half. Okay, what are you guys over here? Yeah, okay. We'll see what happens. Let's start here in verse 7. It says, by faith. Okay, that's what I'm helping you on. Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, and holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, that doesn't count, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, not like as in he was passionate and hardcore, but like he lived in a physical tent, all right? As did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of a country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. I'm just going to pause. I just want to see where we're at, because some of you didn't count, and this is your chance to get back in. So, how many times have we heard by faith so far? Wow, folks. Okay. 6. And I know we put 10 fingers up. Let's do that. 6. There we go. 6 so far. We're all on the same page. The rest is up to you, all right? Let's keep going. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned," Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, which every parent says that, anyways, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. That's really good, man, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. I just want to stop there. I just think it's so awesome that Rahab's in this list. We really don't know a lot about her other than she was a prostitute. But she was faithful, trusted God, and she made the list. See, God doesn't care about our past. God isn't so concerned about the background. God can do what God's going to do if we just surrender our lives to him. So I just want you to know. Great. Let's keep going. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Japheth, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. They were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they may be made perfect. All right. You got through it. You made it. All right. How many times do we see by faith in that section?
17.
I heard 16. 16 is the right answer. I don't know. I counted on I went and I highlighted and I hit by faith, and it told me it was 16. Maybe it's 17. Great job. Maybe we added one in. Who knows? But yeah, so by faith, right? Faithfulness, right? There's something that the writer is trying to hit home for us. These are all stories of people that faithfully followed God. I mean, do you know these stories? Have you heard these stories? They're not there just to entertain our kids downstairs. That's not why they're in there. They're not there just to record history. They're there to encourage and to sort of bolster our faith, sort of push us forward. When we're struggling to look back and say, man, God has been so faithful. God has done so much. And I can move forward because God hasn't changed. And in that quick overview, I know that was quick. That was thousands of years of history, right? And I'm really glad at verse 32 he said, hey, I don't have time. Like, man, I'm really glad because I don't have time either, right? I'm really glad he decided to condense when we got to verse 32. But there's a lot in here for us to wrestle with. And as I look at these stories, there's just some really powerful things. But one thing, a theme shows up is that each of these people sort of had moments where they faced struggle and they faced triumph. It was sort of this mix. Like nobody kind of had, like, man, everything in their life went awesome. There were times when it went great. There were times where it really stunk. Like Abraham, which is a good chunk of that. Abraham lived as a foreigner in a land that God said is yours. He lived as a foreigner his whole life in that land. Even though God said, hey, this is going to be yours, and I'm going to give you descendants, most of his life was spent wandering. But he saw God come through on the promise of a son, on this promise of blessing the nations through his offspring. He saw it happen. We see Moses, right? Moses spent 40 years in the desert, okay? I don't want to sign up for that. Like no one ever wants to sign up for 40 years in the desert. He faced persecution alongside the people of Israel from the hands of Pharaoh. But also he saw God do these amazing plagues and to free the people from the grip of Pharaoh, right? And drown all the army in the Red Sea as they passed on dry ground, and then the water came back. He saw sort of this mix, right, of struggle and triumph. And if that happened to them, man, that just encourages me. I don't know if that encourages you, but that encourages me to know I'm not the only one who faces mountaintops and valleys. Right? Life is not always great. It's not always bad. There's moments where you're going to face a little bit of everything. And when it comes to moments of triumph, a lot of times we really don't question God. In fact, we really don't even think about God, right? Life's going great. God's there, but, man, I'm doing this. Then when moments of struggle hit, it's like, God, what's going on here? What in the world? I'm faithful. Like, what's going on? And we see that, hey, this is not new. A life that faces this mix of suffering and triumph is not new. It's been happening for thousands of years to the people of God. Is being faithful to God does not mean, hey, here's a ticket to ride the train of free life. Everything's going to be great. Like, that's not what it is. It's this mix of triumph and suffering that follow the people of God. And it's why we need these stories, right? We need to know that we can look forward, like that God has something better for us, just like he had for them, that we can look up and be right. Like, my world may be swirling right now, but God is still in control. He's still here, and his power is just as real as it was then. So as we sort of talk about suffering, and our stories look different, but it's still the same. And we're going to talk more. The writer's going to get more into this next week. But maybe what you're thinking is, well, what allowed all these people to endure suffering? Because there's some pretty intense stuff towards the end of that list. What allowed people to endure that? And maybe in your mind it's like, well, how in the world do I endure it? Because maybe you're facing some things right now that are tough. How do we endure through suffering? And I think what we see here being a time and again, just this reminder is that how do we endure suffering? It's by faith. It's by faith. It's faithfulness. It's just sort of putting your head down and moving forward. Enduring doesn't mean it's solved. It just means that you've got to hope beyond the situation that you're in. And as you can say, I know right now stinks, but I know God's still in control. And I know I've got the certainty to know, and I've got this sense of God's going to do it. I'm anticipating God's promises. He's got things for me. If I just hang on, if I just follow him. Our perspectives, these two perspectives allow us to sort of overcome the discouragement and obstacles that we see in the world around us. And sometimes we fall into this trap of thinking, well, they had it easier back then. They saw God do all that crazy stuff, right? Of course it was easier for them to have faith than for me. I've never seen God part a Red Sea or even a pond. How can I have faith? Listen, it wasn't any easier for them than it is for us. And in verse 39, that's what it says. It says that they were all commended for the faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. They still didn't even get to see the finality of it. They didn't get to see it come true at that point. It was still in the distance. They were still looking ahead. So it wasn't any easier for them than it is for us. And that's why he says in verse 4, he says, because listen, God has something better in mind for all of us together. Collectively, God has something better in mind. And really what he's pointing to is this. This is where we're going to get here in just a second. Let's keep reading here in chapter 12, verse 1. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, who is the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God, right? He's completed it. But then verse 3, consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So God has promised something greater, something for us to consider, something for us to focus on. What is it? It's Jesus. right? This is what this whole series has been about, how Jesus is greater than our struggles. Jesus is greater than our triumphs. Jesus is greater than you. He's greater than me. We're supposed to consider, we're called to look to Jesus. Why? Because he is the pioneer. He's the one that starts this faith, and he's the one that perfects it. He's the one that completes it. He's the bookends of our faith. He brings it all together. He's the one that makes it complete. So we're called to consider, to focus on Jesus. And I love, so it starts with this therefore. And we all know when we see therefore, we've learned in this series, we have to ask, what's it there for? Well, these 3 verses here are so important because a lot of times we just read chapter 11, say, man, those are great stories of faith, and we just move along. But see, the therefore there is talking about all the stories we just read. Chapter 12, 1 through 3, helps us make sense of chapter 11. All those stories of faith make sense when we understand what's happening here. And what the writer is saying that is if all those people in chapter 11 faithfully follow God, even though they never experienced the fulfillment of God's greatest promise, which is Jesus, how much more so can we walk in faithfulness on this side of the promise? We've received the promise. They saw it in the future. We get to live it out. So how much more so are we called to faith, to faithful living, to trusting God, to walking forward in faith no matter what life throws at us? That's what the writer is encouraging us with. It's what he's encouraging his readers with. And it talks about this great cloud of witnesses, right? All these stories that we've just read, this awesome list of people that did it. And they didn't do it like they weren't necessarily awesome, but they trusted God. They had these ups and downs. That's what this faithful cloud of witnesses is. It's not a bunch of dead people on a cloud watching us. That's not what he's talking about there. He's pointing back to all these stories, saying, since we have this history behind us, let us run with perseverance a race marked out for us. And I love the idea that this cloud metaphor that he uses, because he had no idea. The writer had no idea. That thousands of years later, we would understand what the cloud is, because a lot of you store things that are really important to you in the cloud, right? Your files, your photos, like things that are of value to us, we store in the cloud because we need, in case we ever need them at a moment's notice, we want to be able to draw from them, be able to know that they're secure, know that we can lean in and get those things when we need them most. And that's what these stories are. It's sort of like the cloud of these stories that when life is tough, we can draw from and be reminded of God's strength, be reminded of God's power, of his faithfulness. That's why these stories are here, for us to draw from. We're called to run the race with perseverance. And I love, he uses this metaphor of a foot race, a long foot race, which was common, the Olympics and different things back in those days. That's a bummer because I'm more built for short distances. You know what I mean? Like anybody else that I'm talking about. I'm built for like fast, short distances downhill, and specifically in emergency situations. It's the only time it comes out is when I need it. So if you ever see me running, you probably should be running too, okay? Just an FYI, if I'm ever running around here, probably want to follow because what I'm running from, you don't want to see. So we get this picture of this long foot race, and I've never run a marathon. I don't ever desire to run a marathon. But I do know one thing to be true is when you run a marathon, you got to sort of get rid of all the stuff that's going to weigh you down, right? You want to run with the least amount of things you can, right? So there's nothing to draw from your strength, nothing to trip you up, nothing to keep you from being able to run with perseverance. You got to ditch what's weighing you down. It's such an awesome picture here. And let's pull out our Discover cards. Let's just talk for a second about what is weighing you down. Right, as we're talking about running the race of faith, faithful living, what is it that keeps you from faithfully following Jesus? What's the stuff that's tripping you up? What's the stuff that's weighing you down? As you sort of think about that, you say, man, I follow Jesus, or I want to follow Jesus, but what's the but? What is it that eats your lunch? What's the thing that you struggle with time and again, the thing that always sort of creeps its head up at those moments when you're making progress? You say, man, if only it wasn't for this thing. If there is something you find that is weighing you down, would you check that step? And if you want to put that in there, you're welcome to put that in there. We'd love to pray for you. But see, Jesus died so that we could run free. No holds barred. He doesn't want us being held down, being held captive, being tripped up, distracted by these things. And it starts with saying, Jesus, I surrender this to you. Jesus, get this out of here. Throw it off. Jesus, help me overcome. Help me be free of this. So whatever that is, what's weighing you down? And it doesn't have to be necessarily a sin struggle. Maybe it's just distraction. Because busyness is just as deadly as sin. Sometimes we get so wrapped up in what we're doing. And I don't know if you've ever tried to drive and text. I do it all the time. I know you're not supposed to. Distracted driving is not good, right? Because you're not focused where? On the road in front of you. You can't run if you're doing this or you're looking around. Like, you can't run effectively if you're not looking forward. So are there things that are distracting you? These are things that are causing busyness in your life. You recognize, I just need to dump, this hobby or this habit or this relationship, things I need to step back from. I need to work less. I need to spend less time doing this or that. Whatever. Are there things that are weighing you down? We're called to throw off those things that weigh us down and fix our eyes on Jesus. And this is probably my favorite part of the whole passage today, is verse 3. This beginning says, consider him. I think this whole thing hinges on that. Consider him. Consider Jesus, so that we will not grow weary and lose heart. Don't consider someone else's situation or consider how good it's been or how great it can be. Focus on Jesus, right? Because he's the one who starts us. He's the one that completes it. Jesus is the source of our faith. What does it mean to consider Jesus? And I can tell you what it doesn't mean. What it means, we'll wrestle with that. But what it doesn't mean is not, what would Jesus do, okay? Don't just ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Okay, you're not Jesus, so don't try. But also, I don't think it means consider like as in, weigh all the options on the menu before you order. Okay, it's not like, man, build the pros and cons list. Well, should I consider Jesus in this? This would be great here, but what about that? That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about considering Jesus. The definition is to think carefully about something. To think carefully, to ponder, to sort of have this deep moment of like just focus and just to draw from Jesus. So to consider Jesus means we're to look at him as the one who has perfectly, faithfully endured the worst opposition, which is your sin, it's my sin, our shame, and is overcome. It's because he has overcome that we don't become weary and give up. To consider Jesus doesn't mean we look at the suffering that he faced and say, man, if Jesus can do it, so can I. You can't. That's why Jesus came. He came to remove the obstacle that we could never remove on our own. To unchain the thing that was keeping us from him. The thing that was tripping us up, that we could not get past. And to rescue us. That's what it means to consider Jesus. To say, Jesus, thank you. Thank you that you did what I could never do. Thank you that you perfectly overcame. You endured the cross, my sin, and you overcame. You did what I'm never able to do, but I trust in you. I rest in what you've already accomplished. You've sat down. You've finished the work. This next step on our Discover card that says, consider Jesus when. Are there times and seasons in life where it is hard to consider Jesus? Where life just gets so crazy that it's really hard to see him. In those moments where you're weary, where you're tired, where you feel like giving up. The writer here says, hey, when those moments come, we're called to consider Jesus. So if you recognize there are seasons or there's moments in life that you're facing where you need to consider Jesus, where life is just beating you down and you just need to sort of set your sight back on him, sort of get the reset, look forward at his promises, look up at his power and his presence. Would you check that box? Feel free to put that in. But it may not be a bad thing. It may be a good thing. Like I was saying earlier, sometimes we don't think about Jesus because life is great. And we just sort of got it figured out. Maybe it's a great thing. So, in the midst of this, whatever it may be, I need to consider Jesus. I need to be reminded of who he is and what he's done for me. And the last step is memorize Hebrews 11:1, which says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance of what we do not see. If you'd like to memorize or ponder or marinate on Scripture this week, you're welcome to join us in that with Hebrews 11:1. Let's pray as we transition into communion. Jesus, we thank you. We take a moment, Jesus, just to remember, to consider what you've done for us. Jesus, what we could never do for ourselves. What my sin enabled or disabled me from being able to do, Jesus, you made a way. You came, you suffered, you endured, but you had your eyes focused on the hope that was for you, but also for me, the promise that God, you made that we could be free, that we could be close to you again. So Lord, I pray today for those that for the first time, or Or maybe the 100th time that said, Jesus, I want to stop knowing about you, but I want to follow you. I want to faithfully follow you. Lord, I pray you'd fill them with your love. Holy Spirit, would you fill them with your presence? God, would they be made new? Lord, for the areas where we struggle, where we're weighed down, God, I know life can get weary at times. Things can trip us up. Sin is so sneaky, and that's why, Jesus, you came, because we cannot break its hold on us. If there are things that are weighing us down, Jesus, I pray we would surrender those to you. And just to, really just a check on a Discover card would be just the first step of us throwing off, of embracing what you have instead of holding on to these things. And Lord, if there are those today, God, that are just really beaten down, they're weary, and it's been hard to consider you. It's been hard to see you in the midst of what life has thrown at them. Lord, I just pray today, would you encourage their hearts as they set their sights on you? I pray that they would grow in their love, that they would just be restored in their passion. Jesus, they would not grow weary and lose heart. We just thank you that you are faithful, that you have given us these stories of faith, but Jesus, you've displayed it perfectly. So we worship you today. In Jesus' name, amen.